Hello and welcome to the 2024 MIFF Schools program. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live, learn and work, and to pay respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. On behalf of MIFF, we believe in celebrating the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with MIFF Schools programs from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the film texts to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCA, and to subjects such as English, EAL, Literature, Media Studies, and to the Film Study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those courses, there is this key focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to critically engage with media texts across a range of contexts. And this is obviously a key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. And so for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not necessarily as a replacement or a substitute for the focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those elements. While the MIFF Schools program is ideally suited to students within French, Japanese, Mandarin, Spanish, and German language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a diverse range of subjects, abilities, and age groups, preparing students for text-based assessments and really developing those visual literacy skills. And so given the importance of visual literacy across a range of subjects, I'd recommend that prior to attending the screening, that teachers introduce or revise some key terminology and film techniques to outline the elements of the text that students should be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce the need for students to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining, films are fun, but there's also an expectation that they'll be analysing those films, whether as part of a non-English language course or English, EAL, Media or Film Studies unit. I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in more detail shortly, but a general overview of film techniques would be beneficial prior to the screening. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can assist in that process, whether on YouTube or in textbook form. But I would also emphasize from the outset that it's crucially important that students can first identify the technique, secondly, that they can understand its general function in creating meaning within the film, and thirdly, that they can apply that knowledge and that terminology to an analysis of the specific text in the context of the narrative, the characters, the themes and ideas that the film is exploring. And it's really difficult to achieve that final outcome unless the first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so with that in mind, some of the basic techniques and terminology that students should ideally be familiar with are things like cinematography, so the use, for example, of a close-up shot, or a wide-angle shot, or camera movement, the various components of mise-en-scène, so basically everything that goes within the frame, the use of props, costumes, lighting, the blocking of actors, the composition of the frame, where relevant, things like music and lyrics, sound, dialogue, voiceover, the use of editing, narrative structure, the story elements within the narrative, and to things like visual motifs and symbolism. So as I mentioned, these basic building blocks of film language are really essential to establish pre-screening. And by setting these up prior to the screening, you're giving the students something to be on the lookout for while they're watching the film, rather than trying to work backwards after the screening, which is almost always less effective. And so depending on the age group or the academic level of the students, you could always assign individual students or groups of students with a particular technique or element of the film to be on the lookout for, to report back in the post-screening classroom discussion, so that they're not necessarily overwhelmed in attempting to look for everything all at once, especially if these are students who might not have a lot of experience with film analysis. Okay, so let's move on to looking at the film in more detail now. I should mention that this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid as much as possible giving away any crucial plot details or revelations within the film, while still providing an overview of aspects for analysis that might help structure classroom discussion. So, Alemania is a Spanish-language film set in Argentina, on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, in the late 1990s. It focuses on a 16-year-old girl named Lola, who is determined to go on a student exchange to Germany. However, her parents are facing financial pressures. Her older sister, Julieta, is experiencing quite acute mental health issues, all of which potentially jeopardize her overseas plans. So this is a partly autobiographic debut feature from the director Maria Zanetti, and it's a really tender and thoughtful teen coming-of-age drama. Okay, so just as an overview, some of the key themes and ideas that are explored within Alemania are things like coming of age, issues of family and sisterhood, independence, reconciling the past, embracing the future, ideas of peer pressure, communication and connections, the weighing up of responsibilities, and certainly mental health is another key theme that we see throughout the film. But when I approach a film text, I often like to start from the big picture and then gradually work in towards the detailed filmic or scenic analysis. So there are a number of contexts here that I think you could ground the film in before moving into that detailed film analysis. So the film really explores a range of social, cultural, peer, family pressures associated with this coming of age. Like I mentioned, mental health or romance or partying, in Lola's transition to adulthood in the setting of late 90s Buenos Aires. So some of the contexts that I think would be useful in grounding and developing students' knowledge of where this film and when this film is set: the geographic context of Villa Ballesta, this suburb or region of Buenos Aires, or indeed the economic context. Again, given economics and the family's financial pressures are certainly flagged within the film, having an awareness of the depression that Argentina went through in the late 90s, early 2000s, again, I think is an important context that would develop students' understandings of some of the themes and the characters within the film. There's also references to mental health, as I've mentioned. I think it would certainly be useful for students to have an understanding of mental health, say in the context of Argentina, or indeed the kind of cross-cultural significance, the fact that Lola wants to leave Buenos Aires to go to Germany. What is the sort of the cross-cultural history and significance between Argentina and Germany? Again, the Wikipedia article might provide a useful sort of launching off point for that. Or getting back to some of the regional landmarks and specifics. There's a scene in which Lola drives past this landmark that really sort of stood out with this wonderful mural on it. And I found an article that talks about the mural and its significance within the neighborhood that this film is set, this piece called Cochina. And I think you could certainly introduce those kinds of resources or references into the classroom discussion to really bolster students' awareness in terms of some of the cultural elements that this film is engaging with. Another context that you could approach this film through is through the film's production background. And here I think interviews with the film's director might really help enhancing students' understanding of the creative process and the filmmaker's intentions for the film. Now, I always sort of say this with the disclaimer that a writer or a director's intentions aren't the only way to understand a film, but they certainly provide a springboard for debate and discussion. Did the audience feel that the director met their intentions? How does having an awareness of the filmmaker's intentions shape our understanding of the film in retrospect, in hindsight? And there are a handful of interviews with the director, Maria Zanetti, on the internet that I think you could refer to. And this is an excerpt from the Cine Europa interview that I've listed there in the resources. where she discusses the significance of Lola's character and the perspective adopted by the film. And she says, "I decided to dive fully into it, but from the adolescent point of view, because I think that at that moment you experience it all with fewer layers. As you get older, you put up a wall with your emotions so that they don't have as great an impact. So not only do I talk about the bond with a sister who suffers from a mental disorder, but also how her teenage sister, Lola, deals with what she's seeing and experiencing, and how she seeks her own experiences that will make her mature. There are circumstances in life that stay with you. She's 16 years old, and suddenly she has to behave like an adult in certain circumstances, and she doesn't want to. So she wants to leave home in order to experience her adolescence with autonomy and freedom." That commentary about Lola's character and the significance of Lola's character and the director's approach would certainly provide a springboard for, say, character analysis in that classroom context. The other interview that I've listed there is one on YouTube that you could certainly find if you just look for Fred's interview, Maria Zanetti. It's in Spanish, so certainly for Spanish language students, this might be a useful resource to rely on in class in terms of translation exercises or listening exercises. But again, those interviews are readily translatable by adapting the subtitles for non-Spanish language speakers as well. Another context, and again we're moving closer to the nitty-gritty of the film analysis here, is through the lens of genre. And so here you could approach Alemania through the genre of the teen coming-of-age film, or through narratives dealing with family conflicts from that adolescent perspective or teen perspective. So these films typically depict a transitional moment within teenhood. And you could ask the students to consider what films or TV shows deal with a coming of age that they've watched. What are some of the points of connection between Lola's story within this film and other coming of age narratives that they might be familiar with? So trying to connect this film to their own viewing experiences and find points of connection or points of similarity and difference with the types of coming of age narratives that they may have seen in the past. You know, what similarities or differences might Alemania share with other films or TV shows dealing with teenagers, with mental health, with family conflict? What alternative insights do those texts potentially offer? Or what approaches do they take? And how do those approaches differ from, say, this one? Some similar or relevant films that this film brought to mind, a film like Paula, which is an Argentinian coming-of-age film that played last year's MIFF Schools program, or, American examples like Lady Bird or Little Miss Sunshine. There are certainly elements of this film that I think are evoked or resonate with those other American films as well, in terms of their presentation of the coming of age and the family conflict and the dynamic between, say, mother-daughter that we get in this film and, say, a film like Lady Bird as well. So in terms of the nuts and bolts of film analysis, coming back to those techniques and the terminology that I flagged at the beginning of the presentation. Like I said, it's crucial that students can identify the technique, have an awareness of its general function, and then be able to interpret that technique within the specific scene or sequence or context that it's being used within the film or across the film more broadly. So something like the close-up. Really a technique used at fostering intimacy between the audience and the character on screen, or being used to focus in on key details within the frame. And here we have an example of an extreme close-up on Lola's eye, giving us this very intimate, introspective moment of her within the film, reflecting the fact that she's in her own head as much as we're sort of intimately connected to her space. The wide angle tends to have a different impact. Wide angles are often used to establish setting or context or place, or characters within a particular setting or place. And again, here we have this interaction between Lola and her grandmother, where her grandmother's telling her, "You've always been more independent." And the fact that the camera is sort of removed from this discussion emphasizes, I guess, a point of independence for her character within that context. So how does the camera work alter our relationship to characters, or to character dynamics, or to the themes or issues that are being played out within the film? These are the kinds of questions and approaches you want to put back to students so they can contextualize the use of these techniques within the film. The use of a high-angle shot, where a camera films someone from above, tends to diminish their status within the film from a general function point of view. Whereas a low-angle shot, where a subject is filmed from beneath looking up, often tends to dramatize a sense of empowerment or self-empowerment within the frame. And again, I think you could argue, or students could argue, that the use of these high-angle, low-angle shots in these two particular instances have that impact. But again, the way in which Lola is filmed over the course of the film differs. So in this case, you could argue that Zanetti is using these angles to demonstrate Lola's journey over the course of the film and her coming of age, her self-awareness, her growing self-confidence, potentially. There are a number of other techniques, again, that students could consider here, and composition is a really key one, and compositional motifs more generally. And what we see throughout this film is the way Zanetti often frames Lola and, say, her parents or her sister at a sort of remove, framed through doorways or windows, or framed through bars on doors or window frames, or like the circular frame of the door that we have in that image on the top right. And again, emphasizing or alluding to this sense of entrapment, a sense of being tied down that the character of Lola feels, and obviously her sister. At one point, she likens her mother to being a prison. So the film is not just exploring these ideas or these themes at the level of dialogue, but through the visual language of cinema as well. Other techniques that students might pick up on, the use of handheld camera work. How does that change or shape our engagement with particular scenes? Adding perhaps a greater sense of authenticity or immediacy of us being in that room, in that moment, watching all the action take place. Same with the use of long takes, where scenes will play out without breaks for editing or cutaways. How does that change the way in which we, as an audience, respond to key scenes? Almost as if we're being drawn into this family and their settings. And also the way that something as simple as lighting can really change our relationship to characters and their mood. The bright natural lighting that we get there of Lola, and this very low-level lighting of Giulietta that reflects, you could argue, the state of her mental health. Mise-en-scène is a really key term in film analysis, and it essentially refers to all the various components of the visual design, from lighting to composition to production elements such as props and costumes, the way they all work together to convey or explore aspects related to themes and to character. How are the various spaces within the film presented or contrasted at a visual level? So again, you might isolate certain settings such as Grandma's house, the emphasis on the family photographs in the background, the sort of the bluish colour palette, the warm lighting at the dinner table. How does that contrast, say, to Lola's home life? Again, there's a greater sense of shadow and low-level lighting that we often see within Lola's home. How does that shape our understanding of her home life, of the domestic space? This contrast between, say, the warmth of family, but also this darkness that lies around them. Or indeed the space of her bedroom. When we look at the mise-en-scène of Lola's bedroom, how does that give us information about her character? Whether through the posters on the wall or the props that we see lying on her bed. Or indeed how those spaces and the kind of colour palettes are contrasted, say, to a scene inside the club. And now we have red lighting as opposed to the blues or the warm lights. How does the mise-en-scène of the club shape this moment and what it reflects for Lola or her friend? Music and sound is another really key element within this film. Music features prominently both in terms of the soundtrack and its connection to various characters. For instance, Giulietta, her sister, plays the piano. We often see Lola listening to music on her Walkman. You may need to explain to students what a cassette tape is, or indeed, shock horror, a CD, which is something I never thought I would have to explain, but here we are. So the 90s context and the significance of music, and perhaps the traditions of sharing or making mixtapes for friends and family is certainly something that perhaps younger students of today will neither be familiar with or have had the benefit of. So again, thinking about music in this broader context. How does music shape particular scenes? What is the connection of music to certain characters? And how does music work to emphasize connections between characters? You could also, from a Spanish language perspective, focus in on the lyrics of the songs. And one example here, this song by Virus. The full lyrics are online, so you can certainly refer to them in a classroom context and use that perhaps for a translation exercise. But there's a number of other key musical pieces at various points of the film that we hear, and I've listed some of those there. So one of the key themes within the film is this idea or this theme of finding one's place in the world. And the film is really structured around Lola's determination to go on exchange to Germany. So what does Alemania represent in this broader symbolic context? Is it just Germany, or does it have broader symbolic meanings beyond the specific location or destination that Lola desires? In what other ways does the film explore or represent these themes or ideas of, say, freedom, of independence, or of finding one's place within the world? There's interesting ways in which the dialogue alludes to this in less obvious or direct ways. In an early scene, we have Lola and I think one of her teachers, perhaps a biology teacher, where the teacher sort of admonishes her half tongue-in-cheek and says, "And think again where the pancreas is." So we get these sort of references, this subtext played out in those kinds of exchanges about finding one's place. Or you need to learn where the pancreas is. And that idea, I think, doubles for Lola's own journey of self in many ways. But these shots of her on, say, the bicycle, or learning to drive, or these low-angle shots of planes passing overhead, how do they all connect us back to Lola and these themes more generally? Or indeed this fantastic sequence we have at a theme park, which again is established by filming Lola and her friend through the wire fencing of the theme park, and we have this scene of them on the roller coaster. You know, is this another example of this sort of freedom but being held down? Or interestingly enough, later on within the film, given that, as I mentioned earlier, so many of the compositions emphasize her behind bars, here we have an example where she's on the other side. What does this suggest? How is the filmmaker using that particular motif to suggest a change, potentially, in her character? And again, you could link this back to those interviews I referred to earlier with the director, where Zanetti says, "Traveling allows you to come back in a different way. In another country, you can be different, and that freedom to be with strangers in other countries, reflecting yourself in others in a way you didn't before, enriches your view of the world and others. We live in such small worlds, and we need to open them up and fill them with differences." Again, I think you could use that as a prompt or a springboard for classroom discussion. So the themes of family, of home, of sisterhood, how does the film explore these issues of family? You know, students, I think, could consider how the various relationships or conflicts within the film are being presented. What are the moments of light and shade? You know, what is the film suggesting about the nature of Lola's family life? How does the film define home, and what does that mean to Lola at this point in her life? So while the film is very quick to acknowledge that this is not necessarily an ideal home life, it also balances those moments with these wonderful little gestures, these subtle gestures in the direction and in the performance. Like we have, say, with Lola's sister, you know, touching her on the shoulder at this sort of key moment within the film. Or the way in which, again, uses visual techniques of, say, focus and camera focus to suggest both conflict and allegiances within the film. So in that middle image, we have Lola out of focus and Julieta is in focus. So that playing off the contrast between them, or the conflict between them, through the camera focus. And then we get this pull focus where both of those characters are now out of focus and the focus is in the deep background for the rest of the family. Again, playing on a different kind of contrast. So again, encouraging students to think about how the visual language of cinema is playing out these conflicts and these dynamics within the family in ways other than simply through dialogue. The other element where I think you could touch on or develop this focus on families is through a gender perspective. So female characters and relationships really take center stage within the film. How do these relationships contrast, say, with those involving male characters within the film? You know, I think this film really lends itself to a kind of gender analysis and gender interpretation. In terms of motifs, we have the motif of television that we see throughout the film. The opening sequence is of Lola, her mother, and her grandmother, again, 3 generations of women, watching a TV program or a film in which a couple is about to be shot by a firing squad. And we hear the response to that in the dialogue. So intense, it's beautiful, but it's too sad. So how does that sequence, this opening sequence of the film, frame the events and the themes of Alemania? Is it a reflection on the power of art and film? That yes, films can be intense, they can be sad, but there's a beauty in that as well. I think the filmmaker really is almost establishing her intentions for the film in and through that opening sequence. But we have references to the television throughout the film in other sequences. A cracked TV screen, a TV program about the nature of art, or video games that we get in another sequence. And in a way, this links us to the broader theme of technology within the film, certainly the focus on cameras. So given the film's historical setting, pre-social media, pre-smartphones, what role does technology play more broadly in the lives of Lola and her family? How does the influence of technology on the lives of the characters within the film differ from us today? What might be the significance of video and photographic cameras within the film in connection to the film's themes of family, of nostalgia, or of memory? And again, bringing those back to, say, Lola's character and where her character might be in terms of, again, these ideas of, say, reconciling the past and looking to the future. Like cameras, mirrors are another visual motif throughout the film. So how do they connect to the characters and themes? What potential meanings or connotations are produced through the symbolism or the motifs of mirrors? How do different characters see themselves reflected in mirrors, or indeed in other ways? So we get references to mirrors and images of mirrors, and Lola pictured in mirrors throughout the film. So thinking back to these ideas of maybe self-acceptance or the coming of age or identity and maturing being played out at the level of these visual motifs as well as dialogue. Theme of mental illness I've touched on already, but students should really consider how the film presents and explores the issue of mental illness, both in terms of Julietta's character and also its impact on the entire family. There's a great line of dialogue within the film where the grandma tells Lola, "When your head is on fire, love is not enough." I think that would be an ideal prompt for students to consider what the meaning of that is and how that relates back to these questions about mental illness and how the film is engaging with these ideas. And without giving anything away, or as much as I can, in terms of the concluding images of the film. So students should really consider the creative choices that the directors made regarding the ending and the concluding imagery. What impression might the director be attempting to leave us with? What does the ending suggest about Lola's future? Does the ending of the film point away towards the resolution of her character's conflicts, or do ambiguities and doubts persist? And here I would definitely encourage students to come up with a range of interpretations, or for teachers to encourage a range of interpretive possibilities, that there is no one right answer in terms of how students interpret or understand the film. In terms of connecting all these dots in the form of assessment, and this has certainly been a popular strategy for language courses in the past, students could be encouraged to read and critically engage with published reviews of the film and then respond by writing their own, whether in English or, say, in Spanish in this case, drawing again on their close analysis of the film and utilising the terminology that I've been touching on throughout the presentation. And here's an example of a review in English from Cine Europa by Alfonso Rivera, where he writes, "With the camera getting up close and personal to the faces of her performers, Zanetti builds a small, ultra-sensitive and intimate film, cramming in much of her own life experience, as it is indeed dedicated to her brother Mariano, who, after a 17-year mental illness, took his own life at the age of 44. However, Alemania is not a sad film. On the contrary, it is, narrated from an adolescent perspective, a love letter to her family, a celebration of resistance, affection, and resilience that unfolds during a time prior to the digital revolution, when cassette tapes were a vehicle used to pass on songs, emotions, and feelings." Oh, what a time that was. So yeah, I've listed the Alfonso Rivera review there and a link to a review that's also in Spanish. So something you could introduce in a classroom context as a translation exercise. And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, just head on over to miff.com.au/schools, and you will find all the information and resources, as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson, and MIFF Schools programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very pleasurable and educationally productive viewing at this year's festival. Thanks so much.